Hi, I'm David Henry Hwang. I'm a spotlight playwright at Signature Theater. And we're about to watch a short film adaptation of my play, Trying to Find Chinatown, which premiered at Actors Theater of Louisville in 1996. The film is directed by Jeff Liu. And please stick around afterwards for a discussion moderated by Duke University professor Esther Kim Lee with Jeff Liu and myself.
Good. That was really great. I mean, a fiddle. I mean, I'd heard them at square dances, on country stations and all, but wow. This must really be New York City. Oh, you're not just doing this for your health, right? Look, I'm not a millionaire. I'm just...
Don't call it a fiddle, okay?
Oh, I wasn't.
You sound like a wuss, a hick, a dipshit.
It just slipped out.
If this was a fiddle, I'd be sitting here with a cob pipe, stomping in my cowboy boots and kicking up hay, and then I'd go home and fuck my cousin.
Oh, well, I don't think
Do you see a cob pipe? Am I fucking my cousin?
Well, no, not at the moment, but...
Well, all right, then. This is a violin. Now you give me your money, and I ignore the insult. Herein endeth the lesson.
Listen, $1's more than I've ever given to someone asking for money.
Yeah, well, this is New York. Welcome to the cost of living.
What I mean is, maybe in exchange you could help me?
Jesus Christ, you see a sign around my neck that reads Big Apple fucking Tourist Bureau?
I'm just looking for an address. I don't think it's far from here. Maybe you could...
You look him such a goddamn softie. Oh, fuck you. Suck my dick, you and the cousin you wrote in on.
I don't get it.
Eat me. You know exactly what I'm talking about.
I'm just asking for a
13
little...
Dolier Street? Like you don't know where that is?
Of course I don't know where that is. That's why I'm asking.
Come on, you trailer park refugee. You don't know that's Chinatown?
Sure, I know that's Chinatown.
I know you know that's Chinatown.
So? That doesn't mean I know
so
where Chinatown is.
So why is it, out of all the street musicians in the city, you chose me to point you in the direction of Chinatown? Let me guess, was it the earrings? Didn't think so. The Hendrix riffs? Guess again, you fucking moron.
Now, wait a minute.
What are you gonna ask me next? We can find the best dim sum in the city? Whether I can direct you to the nearest opium den? Or maybe if I happen to know how you can meet Miss Saigon for a night of nookie followed by a good old-fashioned ritual suicide? Get your white ass off my sidewalk. $1. Can't even begin to make up for this kind of aggravation. Why don't you go back home and race bullfrogs or whatever it is you do for...
Brother, I can absolutely relate to your anger. Righteous rage, I suppose, would be a more appropriate term. To be marginalized, as we are by a white racist patriarchy, to the point where the accomplishments of our people are obliterated from the history books? This is cultural genocide of the first order, leading to the fact that you must do battle with all Euro-America's emasculating and brutal stereotypes of Asians. The opium den, the sexual objectification of the Asian female, the exoticized image of a tourist Chinatown which ignores the exploitation of workers, the failure to unionize, the high rate of mental illness and tuberculosis. Against these each day, you rage. No, not as a victim, but as a survivor. Yes, brother, a glorious warrior survivor.
Say what?
So I hope you can see that my request is not motivated by sort of racist assumptions.
How did you learn all of that?
All what?
All that. You know, oppression stuff and tuberculosis.
Well, it's statistically irrefutable. TB occurs in the community.
Where did you learn it?
Well, I took Asian American Studies in college.
Where did you go to college?
University of Wisconsin, Madison.
Madison, Wisconsin?
That's not where all the bridges are, by the way.
Oh, right.
You wouldn't believe the number of people who...
They have Asian American Studies in Madison, Wisconsin since when?
Since the last Third World Unity sit-in and hunger strike? Why do you look so surprised? We're down.
I don't know, it just never occurred to me the idea of Asian students in the Midwest going on a hunger strike.
Well, most of them had midterms that week, so they fasted in shifts. The administration never figured it out. The Asian students put that they all look alike stereotype to good use.
Okay, so they got Asian American studies. It still doesn't explain,
What?
well, what you were doing taking it.
Just like everybody else. I wanted to explore my roots. After a lifetime of assimilation, I wanted to find out who I really am.
And did you?
Sure. I learned to take pride in my ancestors who built the railroads, my popo who would make me a hot bolo joke with 1,000-day-old eggs when the white kids chased me home yelling gook, chink, slant eyes.
That's enough.
It's painful to listen to, isn't it?
I don't know what kind of bullshit ethnic studies program they're running over in Wisconsin, but did they bother to teach you that in order for you to find your Asian roots, it might be a good idea to first be Asian?
Are you speaking metaphorically?
No, literally. Look at your skin.
You know, it's very stereotypical to think that all Asian skin tones conform to a single hue.
You're white. Is this some kind of redneck joke or something? Am I the first person to tell you this?
Oh,
Oh, I know Asians are real scarce in the Midwest, but jeez.
No, I see where your misunderstanding arises.
Yeah, it's called you white.
It's just that in my hometown of Tribune, Kansas, and even at school, see, everyone knows me, so this sort of thing never comes up. Benjamin Hwang. I forget that a society wedded to racial constructs constantly forces me to explain my very existence.
Ronnie Chang, otherwise known as the Bowman.
You see, I was adopted by Chinese American parents at birth. So clearly, I'm an Asian American.
Even though you're blonde and blue-eyed?
Well, you can't judge my race by my genetic heritage alone.
If genes don't determine race, what does?
Maybe you prefer I continue in denial? Masquerading as a white man?
You can't just wake up and say, gee, I feel black today.
Brother, I'm just trying to find what you've already got.
What do I got?
A home. With your people. Picketing with the laundry workers. Taking refuge from the daily slights against your masculinity in the noble image of Guanggung.
Hwang who?
Come on, the Chinese god of warriors. And what do you take me for? There are altars to him up all over the community.
I don't know what community you're talking about, but it's sure as hell not mine.
What do you mean?
If you want to call Chinatown your community, knock yourself out. Learn to use chopsticks. Go ahead, try and find your roots in some dim sum parlor with headless ducks hanging in the window. Those places don't tell you a thing about who I am.
Oh, I get it.
You get what?
You're one of those self-hating, assimilated Chinese Americans, aren't you?
Oh, Jesus.
You probably call yourself Oriental, right? Look, maybe I could help you. I have some books that
Hey, I read all those Asian identity books back when you were still slathering on industrial strength sunblock. Sure, I'm Chinese, but folks like you act like that means something. Like all of a sudden you know who I am? You think identity's that simple? That you can wrap it all up in a neat package and say, I have ethnicity, therefore I am. All you fucking ethnic fundamentalists. Always settling for easy answers. You say you're looking for identity, but you can't begin to face the real mysteries of the search, so instead you go skin deep and call it a day.
So what are you? Just another human being? That's like saying you have no identity. If you ask me to describe my dog, I'm gonna say more than he's just a dog.
What, you think if I deny the importance of my race, I'm nobody? There are worlds out there, worlds you haven't even begun to understand. Open your eyes. Hear with your ears. I concede it was called a fiddle long ago. But that was even before the birth of jazz. When the hollering in the fields, the rank injustice of human bondage, struggle of God's children against the plagues of the devil's white man, when all that boiled up into that bittersweet brew called by later generations the blues. That's when fiddlers like Sun Sims held their chin rests at their chests and sawed away like the hillbillies still do today. And with the coming of ragtime, appeared the pioneer Stuff Smith, who sang as he stroked the catgut with his raspy Louis Armstrong voice, gruff and sweet like the timbre of horsehair riding south below the fingerboard, and who finally sailed for Europe to find ears that would hear. Europe, where Stéphane Grappelli initialed a magical French violin to be passed from generation to generation. First he to Jean-Luc Ponty, then Ponty to Didier Lockwood. Listening to Grappelli play A Nightingale Sang in Berkeley Square is to understand not only the song of birds, but how they learn to fly and fall in love on the wing. And finally falter one day to wait for darkness beneath a London street lamp. And Ponty, he showed how the modern violin man can accompany the shadow of his own lead lines, which cascade one over another into some netherworld beyond the range of human hearing. Joe Venuti, Noel Pointer, Sven Asmussen, even the Kronos Quartet with their arrangement of Purple Haze. Now tell me, can any legacy be more rich, more crowded with mythology and heroes to inspire pride? What can I say if the banging of a gong or the clinking of a pickaxe on the Transcontinental Railroad fails to move me even as much as one note played through the violin MIDI controller of my Chlorpaniac? Does it have to sound like Chinese opera before people like you decide? I know who I am.
When I finally found Doyer Street, I scanned the buildings for number 13. Walking down an alley where the scent of freshly steamed tasu bao lingered in the air, I felt immediately that I'd entered a world where all things were finally familiar. An old woman bumped me with her shopping bag, screaming to her friend in Cantonese, though they walked no more than a few inches apart. Another man shouting to a vendor in Say Yup. A youth in a white undershirt, perhaps a recent newcomer, bargaining with a grocer in Hokkien. I walked through this ocean of dialects, breathing in the richness with deep gulps, exhilarated by the energy this symphony brought to my step. And when I finally saw the number 13, I nearly wept at my good fortune. An old tenement, paint peeling, inside walls no doubt thick with a century of grease and broken dreams. And yet, to me, a temple, the house where my father was born. I suddenly saw it all. Gung Gung, coming home from his 16-hour days pressing shirts he could never afford to own, bringing with him candies for my father, each sweet wrapped in the hope of a better life. When my father left the ghetto, he swore he'd never return. But he had, on this day, in the thoughts and memories of his son, just 6 months after his death. As I sat on the stoop, I pulled a YOMYOMF from my pocket, sucked on it, and felt his spirit returning to this place where his ghost and the dutiful hearts of all his descendants would always call home. And I felt an ache in my heart for all those lost souls who were denied this most important of revelations. To know who they truly are.
Hello, welcome to our conversation about the film that you just watched. It's an adaptation of David Henry Hwang's play, Trying to Find Chinatown. Let me introduce myself first. My name is Esther Kim Lee. I'm the moderator for today's conversation. I'll be introducing the speakers in a bit, and just a little bit about myself. I'm a professor of theater studies and director of Asian American and diaspora studies at Duke University. I specialize in Asian American theater, and I have written about David's plays in a book titled The Theater of David Henry Hwang. So I know his work very well, but I always learn something new every time I hear him talk. So I'm really looking forward to our conversation. Thank you to Ivan, Jonathan, and others at Signature Theater who made this event possible. Let me first introduce the director, Jeff Liu. He is a writer and director for film, theater, and web, formerly the literary manager at East West Players and resident dramaturg, resident director for Lewiston Theater Ensemble. He's currently resident dramaturg for Ojai Playwrights Conference. He co-wrote and co-produced the indie feature, The Last Tour, which premiered at the LA Asian American Film Festival and won the jury prize for Best Screenplay. Another feature he co-wrote, Charlotte Sometimes, won an audience award by the South by Southwest Film Festival and was nominated for 2 Independent Spirit Awards. He also adapted and directed the Pulitzer-nominated play Yellowface by David Henry Hwang for the YOMYOMF network, which I think stands for You Offend Me, You Offend My Family, on YouTube, where it is still available to watch for free. It is a wonderful production. I use it for teaching all the time. I encourage all of you to watch it. Jeff's theatrical productions include the LA premiere of Chinglish by David Henry Hwang, which became the highest grossing play in the 50-year history of East West Players. Welcome, Jeff. Now, David Henry Hwang probably needs no introduction to Signature Theater community. He is, of course, one of the most prominent and prolific playwrights of our generation, having won numerous awards and accolades, including the Tony Award for Best Play for M. Butterfly. He has penned dozens of plays, starting with FOB in 1979, to Golden Child, Yellowface, Chinglish, Kung Fu, and most recently, Soft Power. While he has been successful commercially and mainstream theater, he's best recognized as a playwright who seeks new ways to tell a dramatic story by experimenting with and in innovating new dramatic forms, and also with collaborating with a number of different artists across genres. David is currently head of playwriting at Columbia University and is working on a number of new projects spanning theater, opera, film, and television. Last year, he was elected to the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, and earlier this month, he was named this year's Playwright Sidewalk inductee as part of the annual Lucille Lortel Awards for Outstanding Achievement Off-Broadway. Congratulations, David, and welcome.
Hey, thank you.
Now, let's jump into it. So David, this play was written, as you say, in 1996, when politics of race and identity were different than they are now. So the context of the play is specific to the 1990s, when things were in many ways a bit hopeful, dare I say. Can you talk a little bit about that context and what you wanted to say with the characters?
Yeah, I think that I have to sort of trace the origins of this play back to my 1993 huge flop, Face Value, which closed in previews on Broadway. And Face Value was intended to be a comedy of mistaken racial identity. And after it failed, I continued to work with this basic idea for the next, 13 years, 14, 15 years, until eventually rebirthing it in some sense in the play Yellowface. So along the way, I think there were several studies, if you will, that I did, shorter plays to try to dramatize this idea of race being a construct, race being fluid, the degree to which we others perform race or we perform our own race. And so I think Trying to Find Chinatown comes out of that context, and in some sense, a more optimistic arc where we were maybe beginning to look towards what would be positive about a post-racial society. And subsequently, we've learned that, the country was not moving forward and has not moved forward as quickly as some of us had hoped in the 90s.
So in the context of now 2022, so what do you think of the play now? Like revisiting the play, does it generate different meaning for you? If so, what would that be?
I mean, I think of the play now the same way in some sense that I think about Yellowface, which is that it requires us to hold two separate ideas in our head at the same time. One is, yes, race is a construct, and yes, there is a sort of long-term goal of a society that can move past that, and it's useful to interrogate our notions and associations with race in order to help move that forward. So hold that in one's head at the same time that we hold this idea that race is still very much present in our lives. Racism and white supremacy are, if anything, more visible now and more acceptable than they were in the 90s. And we have to respond and combat racism. So I think of it now in terms of being able to hold those two somewhat contradictory ideas in one's head at the same time.
Yeah, so Jeff, when you decided to adapt this play, what led you to that decision? I mean, you could have chosen from a number of plays by David. So what about this particular play interested you, and what caught your attention as a director?
Yeah, well, having worked on Yellowface already, certainly the themes felt as relevant as ever, a bit based on what David was just saying, that how we evolve, how we think about identity, right? And then what that identity means now as opposed to then, where Asian Americans fit, as non-Black or brown BIPOC people of color, right? And what that means, that we've got choices to make as to where we stand. But actually, the biggest reason I chose this one is, you know, I'm always looking for things to do, and sometimes, you know, trying to get the full production of the feature film off the ground is just feels ridiculous. And it's like, well, a shorter thing could be more doable, right? Although nothing's ever as easy as you think it's going to be. But the main reason was I made friends with an actor whom I found out is actually a quite accomplished violinist. And all of a sudden it was like, wait a second, do you know this one act, Trying to Find Chinatown? It's like he wrote it for you, because there's a stage direction that says something to the lines of, well, it's not realistic to ask the actor to actually do it. So there's how you do it with sound cues and things like that, right? And it's like, I use this guy and we can do it for real. Right. And it's just like people who can sing or dance. There's just something incredibly charismatic and sexy and exciting about that. People who can really play instruments live. It's the same thing. And that really excited me in terms of, it's like he wrote this role for you. We should do this. And it'll be a short. It's doable, you know. And so then in looking for the other actor, you know, there's this very clear description of him in the play. And I had referrals from friends and stuff. And I found out that Matthew Allen Edwards, who plays Benjamin, he actually played Captain America at Disneyland as one of his gigs. So I thought, I've got an Asian guy who actually plays violin and a white guy who's played Captain America. It's meant to be.
Oh, that's great. I didn't know about the behind the scenes casting story, but that's great. Thank you for sharing that. So if you could stay with this comparison between your adaptation Yellowface and this play, that Yellowface is epic. I mean, there's so many historical moments mentioned and dramatized. It jumps back and forth. Yet, you know, while this play, Trying to Find Chinatown, is very intimate, like space is very much just one place. And I know cost was a factor, but as a director approaching these two different worlds, and the fact that they're both kind of talking about the same thing, right? Same topics of representation, performing oneself, Asian American identity. What can you describe, like how you approach this play differently from the other one? And I think also I'll add that Yellowface is much more, it looks like a stage, right? The theatrical look doesn't disappear. Whereas this one, especially at the end of the film, Trying to Find Chinatown, you actually take the camera to Chinatown, right? So can you maybe do a comparison between the two productions?
Yeah, well, the concept for Yellowface very much was that it was a piece of sort of meta theater, right? And that's part of how David wrote it as well, with those sort of direct address. So we thought, oh, okay, well, if we're adapting that for YouTube, it's a bit like a vlog and it would have that kind of quality. And then because I've always been, you know, so impressed by David's language, which fundamentally is a bit theatrical. It's a little heightened, right? So it's like, well, I'm not going to hide that it's a theater, but I'm going to try and get you to trust me that it's not going to be sort of just a sort of passive recording of a theater, which I think people get maybe a little bored by visually. So here it was a matter of, well, it needs to feel a little bit outside, right? To get that kind of feeling. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to do it at night, is because we had more control of the room. And then having a sort of mostly floating kind of camera to try and get that immediate kind of feel. So then the one character has his violin. That's sort of his sort of extra thing, right? So then the thought was, okay, but it's Trying to Find Chinatown. The ways he's written it, it's very New York. And I'm not shooting it in New York, right? I'm shooting it in LA. So it's like, I've got to get something to help punch that up. And so I have my buddy who lives in New York capture some of that footage that you saw, and it was like, I think that's gonna work. That's gonna work. And so that came about. That there was something about his monologue that wanted just a little bit more of that sort of cinematic transport to edit that in to support Benjamin's monologue.
Oh, that's great. Yeah. So David, what do you think of what Jeff just said about his approach to this play as opposed to how he approached Yellowface in terms of space and use of camera and intimacy and such. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, I love the result. And it's not something, you know, I think one of the reasons I personally don't direct is because I don't really have a good visual sense. I have a good theoretical visual sense. Like I kind of go, oh, somebody who has a good eye could put this element and this element together. I bet it would be really cool, but I can't see it in my head. So the idea that the way that it opens up at the end was a surprise to me and a delight, and it felt just right. And I think that the sort of theatricalism inherent in the visual structure in Yellowface made it clear that that was appropriate, because Yellowface is really all about, you know, all about theater. It's all about meta. It's about trying to create a lot of locations. And so those two approaches seem really appropriate. It's one of the reasons I think that Jeff and I have worked well together on a number of different projects over the years.
So David, so you play the violin. You're actually very good. We were just talking about how you and Phil Kangotanda had a band together well, back in the day. And I know music is such an central part of your playwriting, your body of work, as exemplified by Soft Power, for instance. So why did you decide to include music? If the violin, music, and history of jazz, in many ways, functions as like another character, like a third character. So can you comment on how music, like what kind of role music plays in the play?
So, you know, as you say, even before I started working on musicals proper, I had incorporated music into a lot of my shows, going all the way back to FOB and Dance in the Railroad. So the idea of putting music into a show was not new. What for me, what was different about this was to approach my own history as a jazz violinist. And when I was in college in my early 20s, as you say, I played in a band with Philip Gotanda before we both decided to become playwrights. And I was also in a jazz fusion band. I was in a punk band whose our singles actually being re-released now in vinyl because it's kind of become a collector's item, oddly. But I also, watching, you were asking me earlier about like, how does the piece hit me nowadays? And it occurs to me that I was also struggling at that time as a playwright about what was the role of Orientalism, if you will, in my work, because a lot of my early plays, FOB, Dance on the Railroad, Family Devotions, were praised in the New York Times, were praised in mainstream media when they had more kind of, Orientalist elements, gongs and dragons and stuff. And M. Butterfly attempts to take that and then interrogate it. But I was also wanting to start to move past that. And then, so this play is 96. By the time you get to Yellowface does not have a lot of Orientalist elements. And then, most recently with Soft Power, I feel like we do a completely Western score, which is taken from the American Songbook. So I also look at this play as kind of struggling with the role of music in my work now that I'm looking back at it from this distance.
That's right. There's a line in the play, something like, just because like, there's a gong,
Yeah,
doesn't mean
does it
it's
have to have
Asian.
gongs? You're right.
Right. That's right. Yeah. So Jeff, how did you weave in music in your directing of the film?
Yeah. Well, the biggest factor, of course, is the playing of the violin, right? And then there's also David's sort of slightly mysterious stage direction where he talks about Ronnie's violin sort of accompanies all or part of Benjamin's monologue. And does it start incorporating Chinese elements? I'm paraphrasing, but it's a question mark. It's not a directive, it's like a question mark. And it's like, oh, okay. So he's got a question about this too. What are me and the actor, Paul Date, going to do with this? And that says something different about the ending of the play, right? If you assume that Ronnie is on some level playing that on his own, and he's gone through all the stuff of, no, I'm inspired by jazz and all these things, but is it possible that his interaction with Benjamin has him thinking, right? And then how does that come out in the last notes that you hear? And how do you play with that? And to me, it's almost a little hopeful if it does start incorporating sounds that we associate as more Chinese, right? That you've heard him say all this stuff, which is almost like a self-rejection. And then when you hear that, and I think we show his back, right? And he's thinking, and you hear that. And for me, that has to do with, but through these interactions with each other, we might have conflict, but do we reach to greater self-reflection? And then how is that reflected musically? So that's sort of what I was trying to get at, which I thought was consistent with David's writing and that little stage direction and question mark. And then of course, the other thing about music, which is really interesting to discuss, is appropriation, right? Appropriation versus appreciation. And how do you draw those lines and make that judgment for yourself? And David brings up a really interesting about Orientalism as well, right? Because all of us working here on some level are writing and creating for a majority white audience. And whether consciously or subconsciously, that affects what we present, but also what gatekeepers, again, subconsciously or consciously, encourage, right? But the appropriation thing is really interesting. And that has gone on to this day. I was just talking to some friends of mine about, there was a thing within like the last couple of years about like Black sense, for instance. I think it was because of Aquafina, perhaps. But this whole thing, right? Jazz, rap, South Korean soft power has taken over. Speaking of soft power, every South Korean boy band has a rapper, right? That's norm now. That's sort of required. And of course, no one is saying, that there haven't been major non-Black jazz artists, rap artists, right? But then there's this whole history of American music really wouldn't exist without Black music, right? But then how much credit has been given in the advent of rock and roll, for instance, and how that's sort of percolating all underneath up to this day. So that I was thinking about as well, in terms of both of them sort of, different people could accuse them both, right? Could accuse either one of them of it, but what is the right, or who has the right? I think that is a big question in this play. And then music is one great way to show it, especially if you have someone actually playing, because I hope you can see the passion there, the hours and years it takes to get good at something is real. And so you wouldn't necessarily discount that experience either if you knew that person. And it's the same. The other brilliant thing about this play that's a bit different from Yellow Face is by making Benjamin an adoptee, that sort of changes everything for me, because that's a whole other experience that I'm not comfortable discounting,
Yeah, many of David's plays end with the question mark, having read all of them many times. and butterfly ends with butterfly with a question mark. And then the actor has to decide what to do with that question mark. And it's interesting that, Jeff, you decided to go with the more optimistic conclusion that perhaps Ronnie is more accepting of his Chinese background. But you could also go the other way too, right? Because it is a question mark. When I read this play again, like this time to prepare for the conversation, I was very struck by how angry Ronnie is. And I now see why he was so angry, because David, I think you were angry at how Face Value turned out for one. But I think it's so relevant now because many Asian Americans are angry these days, especially with the pandemic leading to anti-Asian violence, a number of other things going on in our country, around the world. And I was also struck by what happens to Ronnie's anger. Benjamin gets a closure. Benjamin gets to go to his grandfather's tenements, kind of has a kind of he finds what he was seeking. What about Ronnie? I was just like trying to really think about, okay, where is his closure? Does he have one? Or are we comfortable with the question mark? David, where does Ronnie's anger go?
Yeah, that's a very good question. For what it's worth, I feel like I do my best work when it comes out of anger. Or another way I like to put it sometimes is I feel like I'm writing something or saying something that I shouldn't say or write. And I'm being naughty, if you will. And so the way that the play ends in a question mark reflects, I think, my own questioning when I wrote it, and therefore the anger that is expressed by me through writing a play, I think is expressed by Ronnie through his music. And that's why it does all kind of come together in this question of how do you express the music at the end of the show? Is it hopeful? Is it angry? I think that there is there's a sort of a legacy of Asian American jazz people, whether we look at, Dan Kuramoto, who founded Hiroshima, or Francis Wong, that whole Bay Area school of jazz by Asian Americans, the late Fred Ho, a lot of Asian Americans who thought of their jazz as a radical project. And Ronnie is not exactly part of that because his rhetoric is trying to escape the kind of boundaries of what people expect from him as an Asian American. But I'd like to think that his anger and what comes out in the music is consistent with this legacy of Asian American progressive jazz artists.
What about you, Jeff? Same question to you.
I totally agree. I mean, again, part of this is wishful thinking too, but I mean, it's natural for anger to be a huge part of the fuel, right? When you begin, when you ask questions, when you think, wow, what is the world like? What is this country like? But I think it's an evolving process. Your art, your activism, your identity, and you hope that for all of us, right? That sort of evolution. And to me, if those notes are what we chose, even that, it's a beginning for him, right? But even that sliver of self-reflection means that you can evolve. You think, you ask yourself questions, you go deeper and you go, well, what does this all mean to me? What do I want to do with my life, my art? So in that sense, it is different. If you feel the one character has more of a resolution, but then a beginning is nothing to sneeze at either.
and I would also add that the anger is the beginning. And
Mm.
Esther, when you talk about the Asian American community being angry today, that is, it's come out of a terrible circumstance, and it's very positive that sort of a silver lining that Asian Americans are learning to express their anger and not shy away from that anger and use it to create change.
Yeah. And David, in my book, I describe you as a dialectical thinker, which, because you have a background in debate, you are a star debate champion, I hear, in your high school. And which means you really can argue both sides. Both sides can be correct, and many of your plays present these kind of two truths. It's kind of dialectical world. You could hold two contradictory ideas at the same time in your brain. So this question is obviously kind of a trick question, a reductive question, because I know how you think. But who is more Asian American, Ronnie or Benjamin?
Yeah, I mean, Ronnie is more Asian American because he is Asian American. There is, there is the sort of empirical truth of that, and in some sense, his Asian Americanness is part of that. Is his denial of his Asian Americanness, which is very characteristic of our identity in our community and how we develop in this country. Benjamin was actually based on a stage director that I met in Seattle, a woman who was, white and had been raised by Japanese American parents. And nowadays, I don't know that that would be such a surprising thing, but in the mid 90s, to meet somebody who I think at that point she was, she was sort of in her early to mid 20s, who had that experience, it was still pretty unusual. And it made me think about this character and that particular configuration of identity. And so, Benjamin has some claim to a cultural history, but is he Asian American? Well, not in an empirical sense.
What about you, Jeff? What do you think? Same question.
I go with Ronnie. I've been thinking about this, sort of the elements of identity, right? And birth, upbringing, choice. I'm going to roughly rank them in that way. And then the other big factor, I think, where Ronnie wins is like, well, if someone is looking to perpetrate anti-Asian violence, who are they going to go after, right? The burden or gift, however you want to phrase it, is simply greater in that level. But again, that's not to discount those other experiences, especially if those claims are made in a spirit of real sort of sincere allyship. Actually, that was going to be one of my questions to David is, did you know someone with that experience? Because in my experience, that's still much rarer, the transracial adoption in that direction versus the reverse. I remember I was trying to do some research on this and I stumbled on Scott Fujita. Do you know who that is? He actually won a Super Bowl, I think, with the Saints one year. And he is an adoptee of an interracial couple whose dad is Japanese American. So he would tell this joke. He's this, very large Caucasian football player, man, that he would introduce himself. Hi, I'm Scott Fujita, I'm Japanese. And that he actually has ended up playing a role in educating people about internment, for instance, and things like that. So I'm like, hey, we need all the allies we can get in this sort of crazy world. But yes, if you were asking me to rank that way, the other thing that strikes me, there were a couple reactions that are falling into place now as people, in talking to people about the play and even the film, is that there were some people who feel like Benjamin comes across almost more sympathetic. That's interesting. I don't necessarily feel that way, but I think part of it is this anger and resolution quality that we're talking about. And then there were other people who were very sort of stuck on the, no, what Benjamin's doing feels like appropriation, you know, and the fact that he looks the way he does was sort of getting to people in that way. And it was like, but if he really was raised by those parents, you can't say he has no right to his experience, right? But I think the way you put it there was very good. Whether he's an Asian American or not is a sort of more charged question.
So does the identity of Asian American require this constant questioning? That seems to be one of the things I'm hearing, and this is something I've been thinking about for a while. And David, you mentioned that Ronnie's struggle, the very struggle, or even self-hatred, that could be part of the Asian American identity. This is an unsettled identity in many ways. Maybe it is a floating idea, kind of floating identity, to kind of use a more academic idea, that perhaps there is no stable Asian American identity, and it's an identity that must be performed or more conferred, or something that needs to be sought out. I know, David, this is something you've been thinking about for a long time, right? And this is what I think your entire body work is about. It's kind of this question, right? And I think one of the ways that you approach this question is this kind of metaphor of face, right? This surface and depth. And the play also gets to this kind of again kind of dialectic between surface, what you see when you meet someone for the first time, what you look like who are you, can we trust what I see, as opposed to depth, like the idea of cultural roots, who I really am behind the mask, behind the face. So I think that's something that you've been, like, I've observed you thinking about for a long time. What do you think of that kind of framing of Asian American identity in this play, and as well as like what do you think about that now that you've written Soft Power and you're working on other projects? Like, what do you think about the identity and how we construct it, or constantly deconstruct it while we're constructing it?
Yeah, I think that I don't know that being an Asian American inherently requires questioning, requires doubt and self-hatred. But I think it is an evolving identity, which arguably all identities are evolving. I mean, presumably not a lot of things stay static in terms of an individual's relationship with a society, that they live in, particularly in America as it relates to race. So things evolve, and as they evolve or go backwards, our relationship to our own identity, our context changes, and therefore it requires a certain amount of redefinition and struggle, which is not to say that that's always going to be how things are, or that those parameters can't change. For instance, when I was a kid, the stereotype about Asians was that we were poor and uneducated, the sort of cooks, waiters, laundrymen stereotype. And that has shifted. So, now we're considered sort of overeducated and rich, which is not true either. But so the fact that the specifics of the stereotype have changed also teaches us that there's no such thing as like a good stereotype, that they're all dehumanizing. And one of the things that I think is really interesting about the pandemic period is that it has, I think, destroyed this idea, I hope it has, that has become prevalent in Asian America over the past 20 years, of the embracing of the model minority myth, of the sort of feeling safe because of white proximity. And I think what this has taught us is that anti-Asian hate is not a bug, but a feature of American white supremacy.
Yeah, what about you, Jeff? I realized that when I was reading your bio, I actually watched some of your films and back when, and you've always also been thinking about this for a long time. So in directing this film, what are some of the questions you're asking, or conversation you're having with actors, and where does you land in this question of how Asian American identity is constructed and deconstructed?
Yeah, I don't know if inherent is quite the right word, but in a way, it feels like it almost is. Like it wouldn't have been if things were different, but given the way things are, it seems like it is, and we didn't necessarily choose it, but given the sort of history and the DNA of this country, right? The way the system is set up, as the non-black and brown people of color with relatively smaller numbers, we are going to be the sort of in-between people, and in a way have always been for a long time. So that means we get certain privileges when it's convenient, and then we are a really convenient other when it's convenient, right? And it's usually not for our sake, it's for political goals that people with more money and power have than us. And it's the game that they're playing, whether sort of domestically or internationally. And it's sort of like, if we can't escape it, you can only be in denial for so long, right? Before you go, well, we're going to have to educate ourselves, and we're going to have to make choices about who we want to be, and then where we want to stand, or whom we want to stand with, and I think that's something that runs through, many of David's play, but many American artists have been asking this question all along in different ways, but it's become starker and starker, over the last few years, and the pandemic. And then also, of course, the rise of Asia and China in particular as an economic power. As that changes the sort of global balance of power, that's going to affect us as well, whether we want it to or not. Do you know what I mean? So it's like, well, one way or another, we're a little bit pawns, and it's like, but we're not pawns totally without agency, right? That we can use our own privilege as American citizens in a sort of first world country, in terms of, okay, who do we want to be? Where do we want to put our sort of whatever it is, money, votes, concerns? And all of that to me runs underneath this. And it certainly has been in the rooms where I'm working with other people and actors, and how people are getting through the day, and just reading news or watching the news every week. It's like there's something new that you have to react to.
Yeah. So I have to ask this question in a somewhat self-serving way, because Asian American Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison appears in the play. And David, you also make fun of Asian American student activists in yellowface. So you've been representing Asian American college students, quite a bit, and at least a couple of times. And I am a professor who teaches Asian American Studies, and Duke just launched a brand new minor program, which is the first of its kind private institution in the South. So I've been kind of very active working with students and in creating space for Asian American studies. And Jeff, you're talking about educating, right? Asian Americans must educate ourselves. what would you say to, say, my students, the younger generation, the college kids who might be angry, who might be frustrated that, you know, things have not changed much since 1996, or maybe why was it more hopeful back then? Like, what's happening now? What would you tell them? What would be something that you want them to know? David, you could go first.
Yeah, first of all, I just want to endorse Asian American studies. I feel like when I make fun of it, I make fun of it as a family member. And when I went to Stanford in the late 70s, we were agitating for Asian American studies. And at the moment at Stanford, you know, yeah, there are some Asian American studies classes, and you can minor in it. I think maybe you can major in it, but it's still not departmentalized. So I find that frustrating. And in terms of being angry, I think this is like Ronnie, it's important to find a way to express your anger. And that anger can lead to change. And it doesn't move as fast as you want. But the fact that it's not departmentalized at Stanford is still really bad, I think. But it's better than it was when I was there. So I think we have to recognize kind of whether you call it the long arc of justice or whether you think of it as a relay race. And we each have a responsibility to carry that baton as far as we can in our productive years. And then, yeah, want to pass that on to your students, and it's their time to take it from here.
Yeah, what about you, Jeff?
Yes, I think education is key. The allyship and solidarity within education is also really, really important. It has struck me, for instance, when Watchmen, the TV show, came out. I hope you guys know that. And that was one of the reasons why knowledge of the events in Tulsa, I think, nationally skyrocketed. So that makes you realize how many, and we have some of the best educations that this country has to offer. And the amount we don't know about certain things, about many things, but especially on these topics of race are fascinating, right? So it's that knowing what the system is going to educate you in, and then how you and your allies fill in that kind of knowledge that you may need, I think is sort of critical to have the proper context to figure out what to do today. Then the other matter is how you channel that anger, right? In hopefully at least some healthy ways. It can be art, but so much of it is like to me, I'm more and more interested in finding intersectional stories of peoples of color, specifically of how do we share space and story and history. And there's a lot, whether conflict, solidarity, whatever, it's all been there, but how much of it has been recorded or taught or dramatized, and it's Black and Asian and Latinx and Native. And it's like, how often do we get to share space and story together in life, in the rehearsal room, much less in the audience and on stage. So calling more of that into being has become more important to me. And in a way, college campuses are a uniquely suitable place to do that, to be able to have some of the luxuries of time and interest and amazing professors, you know, to help make that happen. And I would also say that it's easy to fall into a sort of despair that nothing has changed. I don't believe that. I believe in some ways the obstacle become greater because of the change that is happening and that feels threatening or that requires a backlash of some kind. So in a weird way, it's something to be encouraged by, even though it's not. Do you know what I mean? It's hard, it's stressful, it's terrible in so many ways. But if that's what we have to go through, then it's better to go through with sort of eyes wide open and allies at your side.
Yeah, I think thank you for that message, both of you. I'm gonna take those what you just said as the message of the play, the question mark that David gives us. I think that will be a great interpretation of the ending. This is I think something that you wrote, in '96, but it's such a relevant question, and also open-ended answer question that we are dealing with. So we are out of time already. Thank you so much both for this rich conversation. Like I said, I learned so much from both of you. And this is a great way to honor Asian American Pacific Islander Heritage Month, the month of May. This is why Signature Theater is hosting this event. So I think this is what a wonderful way to honor the month and also to celebrate Asian American Heritage Month. Thank you so much.
Great, and thank you, Esther, for all your insights and for leading such a great conversation.
Thank you too, Esther. Can I just shout out one last little thing? One of the ways I prepared for the film was also the little bit about this play that's in Esther's book, The Theater of David Henry Hwang. So I did use her too as part of my prep. The other thing is Esther has a new book this year called Made Up Asians Yellowface During the Exclusion Era. So I just want to recognize the sort of key role that academics also play in all of these movements, both activism and artistic and otherwise.